defense chiefs from the US-led coalition fighting Islamic State jihadists in Iraq have been meeting here in Paris. Top of the bill, the offensive to liberate Mosul. On the ground, troops continue to converge on the city. Some of them are now within striking distance of the centre. Forces intent on ousting the extremists are disparate, to say the least, and that's left many people wondering what will happen once the final push gets underway. To discuss the offensive, I'm joined here in Paris by Dominique Trinquant, former head of France's UN military mission. French Conservative MP Jacques Millard, who's a stern critic of the Hollande government's Middle East policy, was part of a parliamentary delegation who met Syrian President Bashar al-Assad last year. In Washington, Michael Pregent, who's an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former intelligence advisor to General David Petraeus and the Kurdish Peshmerga. And in Boston is Morgan Kaplan, fellow of the Belfer Center and for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. But first, France 24's James Andre is in Iraq, where he's been following the anti-IS fighters looking to liberate towns and villages on the road to Mosul. On Monday, he's with the Iraqi Army's 9th Armoured Division in the small Christian town of Karamles, close to Karakosh. He witnessed the difficulty fighters face in securing even the smallest of settlements. This is his report.
The armoured column pushes towards Karamles, a Christian village 15 kilometers east of Mosul. Inside, there is fierce fighting between Iraqi infantry and an estimated 15 jihadists.
I'm watching the enemy. When I see a jihadist, I shoot him. I've killed 5 since the beginning of the battle.
These Iraqi armoured vehicles are now positioned very close to the small city of Karamles. There is still sporadic gunfire inside. We will be entering with the army in a minute. We discover a town damaged by heavy fighting. The soldiers lead us to St. Barbara's Church, where they celebrate their victory. Islamic State group fighters used the ancient Christian shrine as a bunker. Underneath, a tunnel network branches out to different combat positions.
This is where they position their rocket launchers and snipers. From here, they fire at the Iraqi forces. We arrived from this side and they fled that way.
There are no IS militants' bodies to be seen. The jihadists have fled towards Mosul in the last stages of battle. Soldiers sweep the town for fighters and mines. On the roof of the church, a sniper notices movement in the distance.
It's a truck bomb. Look over there, there's a truck bomb.
The forces start firing erratically towards the target. In the face of heavy gunfire, the truck driver has U-turned and fled. The situation has become unstable in town. The army decides we have to leave immediately.
James Andre reporting in Iraq there. We're going to open up the debate now, starting with Dominique Trinquant. As we saw in that report from James Andre, it's often slow progress on the road to Mosul.
Of course, but it was planned like that. I mean, when you attack a city, the defense of the city have the advantage. They've been there for 2 years. They have prepared their plan. They've put explosive devices everywhere. They've got snipers. You've seen the tunnels and things like that. So they've got the advantage. So on the other side, the coalition can't use massive bombing like it is done in Aleppo, perhaps, because they want to avoid the comparison between Aleppo and Mosul. And the second point is that they avoid casualty on their side and avoid casualty in the population. So they've got to progress slowly in order to avoid all these casualties.
And how long do you see this taking?
In French, we say un certain temps, a certain time. I don't know. I don't know. The jihadists got the watch. They plan either. They've got 2 ways or 3 ways to defend. Either to defend each street, very fierce combat, and that will take time, or they disappear They wait for the people to come inside Mosul, and there you've got the guerrilla, the urban guerrilla, killing people who are inside the city, or the third one fleeing for another city, for Syria or another city. I guess that it will be a mixture of the two first. They've got, you see these small villages surrounding Mosul. They are fighting here, and then they are going into Mosul. And in Mosul, it will be very difficult because the west of Mosul is the old city, which is very difficult to fight inside.
We'll bring in Morgan Kaplan from the States now. What do we know about how the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, are approaching this battle so far?
Yeah, so I mean, it seems that there are a few ways this can still happen. As mentioned, it's still very early in the process. It sounds like they're going to put up a relatively stiff resistance on the road to Mosul itself. The question becomes what happens once the various coalition forces actually decide to enter the city. It seems there is some debate about to what extent the Islamic State will likely withdraw and basically move out either into the countryside or push back to other cities or closer towards Syria, or to what extent they're going to leave certain forces behind, either to try and hold the city as long as possible or to actually create what would be a very uncomfortable scenario for any forces that are going to enter the city. And that could make the post-conflict environment very difficult in Mosul.
Michael President, is that something you'd agree with?
Is very dense. It's hard to drive a tank. You can't drive a tank on the streets of the downtown area. You can't drive an up-armored vehicle. You can drive a Humvee there, but every building is a potential sniper overwatch, and every road a potential obstacle or IED. So as we've seen the Iraqi security forces in the past, what they'll do is they'll simply level that neighborhood and not even go in it, because they'd rather just destroy it than actually go in it. One of my biggest concerns is what we do with the population. There's no reason to exit 1.2 million Sunni residents from Mosul for 2,000 to 5,000 ISIS residents, or ISIS fighters. There's already an underground movement in Mosul that's targeting ISIS leadership. There are already civilians providing intelligence to the Peshmerga and the Iraqi security forces. We need to let that develop more. There's no reason to go in heavy-handed like Fallujah, Ramadi, and Tikrit in this case, because if we do, we'll simply reset the conditions to the day before ISIS entered Mosul in 2014. And that seems to be the strategy, to do it like Ramadi, do it like Fallujah, and do it like Tikrit. And that's not a strategy to defeat ISIS. That's a strategy simply to exit the population, destroy the city, replace a flag, and then allow ISIS to move west into Syria. And I think that's actually what the strategy is to push the remaining ISIS fighters out, move them towards Syria, and then have the final battle take place in Syria, when you still leave these Sunni population centers ripe for ISIS 2.0 or ISIS moving into an al-Qaeda-like operational stance or operational position.
Jacques Millard, we heard Michael saying there about his fears of potentially hundreds of thousands of people leaving Mosul, how approaching things that way is not a good idea. At the same time, the US is saying it expects a mass exodus within days.
Well, I think that what we heard is common sense. First of all, I'm pretty sure that the combat will be very fierce, and that will be very difficult for the Iraqi army to step in, even if they are supported by the coalition, American, French, etc. I think that there is a danger that it will be very long to get ISIS out of this town, because I'm sure they will fight until the end. And of course, the population, which is still there, civilian, very likely will suffer a lot. And we have another challenge, is that of course the French government, and I agree with him, wants to prevent that the ISIS fly away to Syria. So they want to try to maintain every fighters on the spot and to get rid of them. Secondly, there is another aspect which is very important. It is how the city will be governed afterwards, because that there are first, let's say, a challenge or, let's say, contrast and also opposition between the Iraqi army, which is composed of Shia, and the militias, and all this population, which is Sunnite. So there is a danger also that afterwards, you know, we may have some expeditive justice. So that's a genuine challenge in which we cannot be afford to be involved in.
You were talking just there about ISIS fleeing back into Syria. We had Michael suggesting that that might be one potential objective. What is the strategy?
First, I just want to remind that a lot of the leaders from ISIS are originally from Mosul. So they want to fight also in their population. That's their city. I mean, and they've been, remember 2 years ago, it was not very difficult for them to enter the city and take the city. So what I heard from the conference today is that at the same time that we are fighting in Mosul, we've got to fight in Raqqa at the same time. But it's very difficult because in Syria, it's no longer the coalition which is fighting in Syria. In Syria, you've got different, and you've got mainly Russia supporting the Syrian government. And in Iraq, the coalition is in support of Iraq government. It is not the case in Syria. So it's more complex than it's looked like that. And if we've got all the same enemy, which is the Islamic State, fighting in Iraq, it's something simple because you're in support of the official government, and you've got the Peshmerga who are fighting very well, by the way, on the east. And in Syria, you've got a government, the government of Bashar al-Assad, supported by the Russian, and not supported by the coalition. So it's a bit more difficult. With the same enemy, the organization is very different.
Yeah, this is to circle the square, as we say in French, you know. How do we manage to fight the same enemy, which is the real enemy, and prevent to be involved in other civil war in Syria? I agree. There is another aspect in Mosul, which is very, very important. This is Turkey. Because Turkey has got, soldiers in Iraq, and they are not welcomed by the Iraqi government, and as well as with other states, especially Iran in the region. So that will be very complicated also. And I think that the Turks have been more or less not that much diplomatic because they claim that Mosul is a Turkish city. So you see, that will be very difficult. And you have the Peshmergas, that means the Kurds, who want autonomy in Iraq, you see. And I was in Erbil a few weeks ago, and I can assure you that the will of autonomy of the Kurds, that means in northern Iraq, is very, very strong. So I'm sure that we'll get rid of ISIS in Mosul. But what will come next is another question and a big question mark.
Okay, we're going to bring Michael Pregent back in now. We'll talk a little bit more about Syria later on. You were talking just now about the US and its allies not repeating the mistakes of the past. We've heard a little bit from Jacques there about there are so many forces involved on the grounds, all of whom want to get rid of IS, but all of whom ultimately want different things. That makes it very complicated.
Yeah, it's a very, very complex battlefield. So you have the Turkish special operators that are training the Iraqi tribes, the Sunni tribes in the north, but they also want to prevent a population exodus towards Turkey. So that's their concern. The Peshmerga are coming in from the east to west, and they want to make sure that the population doesn't go towards Kurdistan. The Iraqi army is coming up from the south, and their focus is to actually go into Mosul and defeat ISIS. And then the Hashd al-Shabi, the Shia militias, want Tal Afar, which is over on the west, which keeps ISIS from going to Syria and also keeps the Sunni population from going that way. What I know about Iraq and what I know about Mosul, having served there for a year as an advisor to the Peshmerga, and I just came back from the battlefield 2 days ago, where I was with Peshmerga on the front lines, is that the Sunni population in Mosul, if it has a preferred route to go to for safety, it's going to go towards Kurdistan. It's not going to rush into the arms of the predominantly Shia Iraqi security forces that are partnered with Shia militias. It's certainly not going to go towards Tal Afar, and the Turkish forces aren't going to let it go towards the Turkish border. So you have a population, and I think the strategy is to overwhelm the Kurdish regional government with more refugees, 1.2 million refugees, that gives Baghdad more leverage with Kurdistan. But again, the priorities for each one of these forces, it's not to defeat ISIS, it's not to protect the population, it's to ensure the other group doesn't get more influence or gain more territory. So this isn't really an ISIS strategy. This is a game of Risk, if you've ever played the board game, where people are just trying to get territory and prevent others from gaining influence or gaining more territory.
Morgan Kaplan, is that all that's really at stake here?
I think largely that's correct, and I think there's more to it. And that is also from a pure logistical standpoint, assuming that even half the population of Mosul stays in the city, you're essentially going to have to govern and provide all the institutions that government will provide for a city that is now currently at about 600,000 people. Even if it was down to 300,000, that's quite a logistical task. The other important thing I think to realize, both in terms of immediate security, even long-term security in the city, is to what extent the Sunni population is going to trust the forces coming in, but also trust them to the extent that the Islamic State may not itself come back. I think there could be a fear that the Islamic State still may have informants in the city, or if they were to somehow re-infiltrate, there's a fear of retribution, which has happened in other locations. So I think that what has to happen is there has to be a credible sign and commitment that not only will the local population be protected, but also that the city will run and govern the way it's supposed to do.
Michael Pridgeon, very quickly, how do you see, should Mosul fall, how do you see the Islamic State group reacting?
I see it going to an al-Qaeda-like method, a model where they basically go to ground, and exactly like the previous gentleman just said, basically keep an eye on the population and have retribution attacks. I see it as a rush political operation. I don't see it as a successful strategy to defeat ISIS. I'm concerned that it's being rushed for Prime Minister Abadi. He has a Baghdad timeline, and so does President Obama. I don't believe the forces are ready, and more importantly, the governance aspect, nobody's ready for that. And I believe all groups that come in will be rejected. Sorry for going over time.
Thanks very much. We're going to take a very short break now. The second half of the debate is coming up.